This book draws parallels between people staying in toxic marriages and people voting for evil, really awful political candidates. This specifically is analyzing the small mustache man in Germany in like the 1930s. I tried making this video yesterday and it got basically no views, so I'm pretty sure that saying the mustache man's actual name gets videos suppressed, so I'm not going to say it. When non-Germans watched the mustache man's appearances in newsreels, they were never able to understand the adulation he was given or the number of votes that he received in 1933. It was easy for them to see through his human weaknesses, his artificial pose of self-assurance. For them, it was not as though he were their father. For the Germans, however, it was much more difficult. A child cannot acknowledge the negative sides of his or her father, and yet they get stored up somewhere in the child's psyche. The adult will be attracted by precisely those negative, disavowed sides in the father's substitutes he or she encounters. An outsider has trouble understanding this. I feel like that's worded pretty clunkily, but basically it's saying that children can't see the bad sides of their parent, but the bad parts of their parent still get stored in like their unconscious basically, and then they are drawn to those negative traits in other people in adult life, which they're calling father substitutes. We often ask how a marriage can last. How, for example, a woman can go on living with a certain man or vice versa. It may be that the woman endures extreme torment in this relationship, continuing it at the cost of her vitality, but she is mortally afraid at the thought of her husband leaving her. Actually, such a separation would probably be the great opportunity of her life, and yet she is totally unable to see this, as long as she is forced to repeat in her marriage the early torment, now relegated to her unconscious, inflicted on her by her father. For when she thinks about being abandoned by her husband, she is not reacting to her present situation, but is re-experiencing her childhood fears of abandonment and the time when she was in fact dependent on her father. Negative parts of her husband are triggering her trauma, early trauma, with her father, and then in that kind of traumatized part of her brain, she feels literally dependent on him for survival, the way that a young child is dependent on their parents for survival. I am thinking here specifically of a woman whose father, a musician, had taken the place of her mother after she died, but who had often disappeared suddenly as he went on tour. My patient was much too little at the time to bear these sudden separations from her father without a feeling of panic. In her analysis, we had been aware of this for a long time, but her fear of being abandoned by her husband did not subside until dreams revealed to her what had previously been unconscious. The other, brutal and cruel side of her father, who she had until then remembered only as loving and tender. As a result of confronting this knowledge, she experienced an inner liberation and was now able to begin the process of becoming autonomous. So she had to bring into her conscious mind the negative sides of her father to be able to see then that she was recreating that with her husband, and then to realize that that was the past repeating itself. I mention this example because it demonstrates mechanisms that may have played a role in the election in 1933. The adulation accorded to the small mustache man is understandable not only because of the promises he made, who doesn't make promises before an election, but because of the way in which they were presented. It was precisely his theatrical gestures, ridiculous to a foreign's eyes, that were so familiar to the masses and therefore held such great power of suggestion for them. Small children are subject to the same sort of suggestion when their big father, who they admire and love, talks to them. What he says is not important. It is the way he speaks that counts. The more he builds himself up, the more he will be admired, especially by a child raised according to the principles of poisonous pedagogy. When a strict, inaccessible, and distant father condescends to speak with his child, this is certainly a festive occasion, and to earn this honor, no sacrifice of self is too great. So a child will sacrifice all of themselves in order to get that attention from their father if need be. A properly raised child will never be able to detect if this father, this big and mighty man, should happen to be power hungry, dishonorable, or basically insecure. And so it goes. Such a child can never gain any insight into this kind of situation because his or her ability to perceive has been blocked by the early enforcement of obedience and a suppression of feelings. A father's nimbus is often composed of attributes such as wisdom, kindness, and courage that he actually lacks, along with the attributes every father undoubtedly possesses, at least in the eyes of his children: uniqueness, bigness, importance, and power. If a father misuses his power by suppressing his children's critical faculties, then his weaknesses will stay hidden behind these fixed attributes. He could say to his children, just as the small mustache man cried out in all seriousness to the German people, "How fortunate you are to have me." If we keep this in mind, the small mustache man's influence on the men who surrounded him loses its mystery. This goes on to quote part of a book that they interviewed people who had met the small mustache man. And he was commenting on how people who met him almost always say something like, "It was the best moment of my life." But then when interviewed in more depth to kind of figure out like what made this so magical for you, that it was the best moment of your life, they eventually come around to admitting that it really wasn't. This is in reference to people who got to meet him. I frequently heard people confess that they were afraid of him, that they, grown as they are, cannot visit him without a pounding heart. They have the feeling that the man will suddenly spring at them and strangle them, or throw the ink pot at them, or do some other senseless thing. There is a great deal of enthusiasm, with eyes hypocritically cast up, and a great deal of self-deception behind this talk of an unforgettable experience. Most visitors want their interviews to be of this kind, but these visitors who are fain to hide their disappointment gradually come out with it and say that they were pressed. It is true that he did not really say anything special. No, he does not look impressive. It is not possible to claim that he does. Why, then, make up these claims about him? Yes, they said, if you look critically at him, he is, after all, rather ordinary. But it is the nimbus. It is all the nimbus. And so, when a man comes along and talks like one's own father and acts like him, even adults will forget their democratic rights or will choose not to make use of them. They will submit to this man, will acclaim to him, allow themselves to be manipulated by him, and put their trust in him, finally surrendering totally to him without even being aware of their enslavement. One is not normally aware of something that is a continuation of one's own childhood. For those who become as dependent on somebody as they once were as small children on their parents, there is no escape. A child cannot run away, and the citizen of a totalitarian regime cannot free himself or herself. The only outlet one has is in raising one's own children. Thus, the citizens who were captive of the Third Reich had to rear their children to be captives as well if they were to feel any trace of their own power.